Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 6. This is probably one of the most famous chapters in the Bible because preachers all over the world always refer to what Uzzah did when he touched the ark by disobeying God, and God struck him dead because of it in violation of the law of Moses. A lot of sermons have been preached on this, and I don't think I could add anything to it than what you probably already heard in the past. But it's still an interesting chapter, and I think that we can gain some benefit from it as we go through it in our study. David moves the ark to Jerusalem. Now, before we get started, one thing I failed to mention at the beginning of this class, and I think is kind of evident if you paid attention to it in this particular chapter, is that 2 Samuel does not always go in chronological order of the events that happened in their history. And we see that in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and when you jump over to, I think it's 1 Chronicles chapter 13, you start seeing the events not correlating with each other. And the only thing that I can say at this point is I don't know why, but my assumption would be that 2 Samuel records events by the event itself, and Chronicles may record the event as they actually transpired through their history. So you have a summation of events in 2 Samuel, then when you jump over Chronicles, you start seeing maybe a more systematic approach to it. Now, what I'm not going to do in this class is try to correlate all this between the two books. I don't think that would be beneficial to us, but that's not the intent of studying 2 Samuel. I just want to study what we have here. But to show what I've got, or at least show what I've seen, when you look at 2 Samuel, the course of events in the last two chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6, it says that David takes Jerusalem, and this is in chapter 5, and then Hiram builds David's house. David takes more wives and concubines, and then the Philistines battle David on 2 occasions. Then in chapter 6, we see that David tries to move the ark, and Uzzah dies, and David finally moves the ark to Jerusalem. Now, when you get over to 1 Chronicles, and I should have put, 1 Chronicles, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, these events are detailed a little differently. In chapter 11, it says David takes Jerusalem. Chapter 13, David tries to move the ark, Uzzah dies. Then in chapter 14, Hiram builds David's house. David takes more wives and concubines, battles the Philistine, battles David on 2 different occasions. And then in chapter 15, David finally moves the ark to Jerusalem. So what we see is that in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, David tries to move the ark, and David dies, kind of fits right in there. And the events are a little bit different when we look in the chronological order of 1 Chronicles. So what it amounts to is that when you look at 2 Samuel, chapter 5, it should be David takes Jerusalem, and then David tries to move the ark, Uzzah dies, and then these 3 events, Hiram builds David's house, David's wives, and then the battles with the Philistines, kind of fits right in to the middle of that in chapter 6, where it says Uzzah dies, and then all these events happen, and then the ark finally moves to Jerusalem. Now, the time frame may not be exact. When you start looking at how long does it take to build a house, how long does it do, to do this, it's kind of difficult to get all these straight. And the best thing I can say at this point is as we go through 2 Samuel, if you see something that seems to be out of order from Chronicles, try to understand, I think, that the writer of Samuel is looking at events from their start to the finish, whereas Chronicles looks at it more from a chronological standpoint of how things happen. That's the only explanation I can give at this time. So if you're like Adrian Monk, and when you vacuum your carpet and all the lines have got to be in the exact order, this will drive you crazy. So try not to dwell too much on that. I just wanted to point that out to you in case you noticed it or will notice it as we go through the book. And I think it's more so towards the end of 2 Samuel, you start seeing some events that are happening, and I think in our workbook, or at least the book that David Pratt put together, he makes more notice of this as the events become more obvious. Anyway, food for thought. So chapter 6, when I look at chapter 6, I see there's probably four main things that we need to take, that the chapter deals with. Verses 1 through 2, it says that David and the people went to get the ark of the Lord. Verses 3 through 8, God kills Uzzah for touching the ark. Verses 9 through 19, David transfers the ark to Jerusalem with celebration. And then the last three verses, 20 to 23, after rebuking David for his foolish dancing, Michal is punished by being barren the rest of her life. So those are the four ideas of the chapter that we see. Now, one thing I will say at this, when I got to looking at this, I started chasing rabbits again. You know, it's one of the biggest problems I have, is I start chasing these rabbit trails. And so when David was moving the ark, my first question is how did the ark wind up where it was at? And then the second question I had was, where was the tabernacle and why weren't they united? So I did a little digging around. When I looked at the movement of the ark, I noticed that in 1 Samuel 4 and 4, it was located in Shiloh. Now what had happened was that the ark was always with the people, and they moved with the people through the wilderness wanderings. When they crossed over Jordan, the battles that Joshua fought, the ark was always present there when the people were doing God's bidding. And then after Joshua finally, I guess, settles the land that was given to us, he erected the tabernacle at Shiloh, and of course all the furniture and the ark itself was located in Shiloh. It stayed there for about 400 years. And in 1 Samuel, I want to say, chapter 4, verse 4, the Israelites were battling the Philistines, and the question was, or the problem was, that the Philistines were whipping them pretty bad. And so the elders at that time said, well, the ark was with Joshua during the conquest of the land. Maybe what will help us in this battle is if we bring the ark out here to us, and God will fight his battle for us. Well, of course, they reasoned among themselves without consulting God. So they brought it out to the battle. The Philistines again tore them up pretty bad, and at this point they captured the tabernacle. Captured the ark. So it went from Shiloh to Ebenezer where the battle commenced, and that's where it was captured by the Philistines, and we kind of think that may be where Ebenezer was. They moved it down in 1 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 1 down to Ashdod, and that's where it was erected in their temple in front of Dagon. And of course, we know God toppled the idol over in that case. Anyway, from there they moved it over to Gath. Again, they were having problems. This was 1 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 8. From Gath it went to Ekron, and then from Ekron it went over to Bath Shemesh, and then from Bath Shemesh it wound up at Kiriath Jearim. And the distance from, this is where David went to pick it up at in this particular chapter. So the distance from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem is about 8 miles. And we don't know the distance, how far they went before the ox stumbled and Uzzah reached up to touch it. It may have been halfway, the journey may have been halfway, we don't know. But if it were, then when we see the events that David offered the sacrifice and that he danced all the way into Jerusalem, we're talking about a distance maybe halfway from here to Beaumont. So it's not a very long distance. So this is the travel of the ark and its final resting place, and it stayed at Kiriath Jearim about 40 years. Now, at this particular time, the tabernacle had been moved from Shiloh down to Gibeon. That's where it was located at. And I failed to pull up the passage for that. But here's what I thought was interesting. The distance from where the ark was at in Kiriath Jearim was about 5.5 miles to Gibeon. And again, that's maybe half the distance between here and Beaumont. My question was, why did they not unite the two back together the way it was intended? You know, the distance wasn't that far. You know, they could have easily carried the ark over there to it, or they could have picked the tabernacle up and moved it to where the ark was at and re-erected it. And we're not told this, and we don't know. So the only thing I can surmise is simply this, is that Kiriath Jearim in this map, it kind of looks like it's right there on the border, but actually it was a city in Judea. And the tabernacle was in the territory that belonged to Benjamin. And the only thing that I can surmise is that the two tribes were not willing to give up one to the other. You know, there may have been, you know, through the years some animosity there. You have to understand that even though the nation was united under Saul, there was that division that happened after Saul's death. And so I'm kind of thinking that even though they were united, and we see this kind of throughout their history, that there was always some kind of dissension between the tribes. And even after Solomon had passed away and his son took control of the throne, we see now again that division, and it happens across the lines of Judah and the northern nations. So that's the only thing I can surmise. Why it was united, why they weren't put back together, I don't know. And why they were separated or remain separated will remain, you know, a question to us forever. Second thing is that it says that David built a tent in Jerusalem to house the ark when he brought it to Jerusalem. Again, my question is, David, why did you not go to Gibeon, take the tabernacle and bring it to Jerusalem and erect it there and bring the ark to it? We're not told that. So when I look at the mindset of the Jews at this particular time, my question is, do they really understand the significance and the importance of the tabernacle and the ark together and their understanding of the law? And I think as we start chapter 6, we start seeing that I don't think they quite understood the law to the extent that it was important to them. So with that said, let's go back to our synopsis and let's take a look at our chapter. Now, everything that I just said is, you know, there's a lot of supposition there. So don't take it as, you know, this is the way it happened or this is the way it was. But I tell you these things to try to get you to think a little bit about what we're dealing with here. So when we look in chapter 6 of this particular book, let's see. It starts out in verses 1 and 2. It says, "And David gathered all the choice men of Israel," that is about 30,000. "And David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal Judah to bring Baali Judah." I learned how to say that. To bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name. Now, what is not said here in Samuel is said over in Chronicles. When we look at 1 Chronicles chapter 13, it says that David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds and with every leaders. And David said to the assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you, and if it is with the Lord our God, let us send to our brethren everywhere who are left in all the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and the Levites who are in their cities and their common lands, that they may gather together to us, and let us bring the ark of God back to us. For we have not inquired at it since the days of Saul." Then all the assembly said that they would do so, and the thing was right in the eyes of the people. Now, I don't know if you picked up on what Chronicles tells us that 2 Samuel doesn't, is that the fact that David consulted the Levites and the priests, and they were there with David when the ark was being moved. So what does that tell us about the Levites and the priests at this particular time? Did they know how to move the ark? If they did, they would have told David, this is how we're supposed to move this ark. But they didn't. So now when I look at why the ark was in one place and the tabernacle was in the other, and the two were not united the way they should have been, I kind of get the impression that there was some significant loss of understanding of the law of Moses. And we'll see, and you will see later when David does move it, in 1 Chronicles, David specifically says the priest are the ones to carry it. So evidently they consulted the law and they found out exactly how this thing was supposed to be moved. So anyway, they gathered all these people together. They went to Baale, Judah, and to collect the ark. And it says in verse 3, they set the ark of God on a new cart, and they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. They brought it out of the house, which was on the hill, accompanied by the ark of God. And then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, harps, stringed instruments, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. Instrumental music was allowed under the law of Moses. God allowed David to introduce these into his worship. Today, we don't have that allowance by God to do that today. And those that say that, well, David had instruments of music, well, as I said before, the worship of God by singing and instruments and what have you was not authorized, or was not a command under the law of Moses, but was later added by David. And I should have wrote that passage down. It says that the prophet came and told David that God allowed him to do this. So there was an inquiry to God, God allowed it, and therefore it was introduced. Today, we're told how we are to worship God in song, and that is with the fruit of our lips. And of course, when they came to Nachon's threshing hole, the ox stumbled, Uzzah reached up, touched it, and God struck him dead. Now, it says that David, let's see, struck him dead, and David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. What do you suppose David became angry with God at this particular time? I mean, Uzzah was doing a noble thing. The ark was about to hit the ground and maybe go into 100 pieces. He reaches up and he catches the ark and keeps it from stumbling. Was it in David's mind that he was angry at God because he was saying, God, this thing is about to hit the ground? You know, he was actually trying to preserve your footstool on earth, your place that we come to worship. Why are you striking this man dead? You know, he was angry with him because he was, in his mind, he thought Uzzah was doing a righteous thing before God by protecting what belonged to God. But that was not the case. He later understands that if you violate God's law, you have to suffer the consequences. And that's exactly what happened to Uzzah. But also was he angry, but he says that he was also afraid of the Lord that day. He saw what God had done to Uzzah because of what Uzzah had done. Not only was he kind of angry at God because he killed Uzzah, but he was also afraid of God, thinking that, you know, how am I going to move this ark now? You know, if God did this to Uzzah, what will he do to the rest of us if we try to move it and this event happens again? You know, if I put it back on another cart, or put it back on this cart, and we try to move it and he stumbles again, you know, I'm afraid God is going to, you know, strike us all down because of this. So instead, he moves the ark into the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Odom for 3 months, and God blessed his household. And then later it was told David that, and at this particular point, you know, when I said events kind of plug in here, I think it was at this point that the events of the wars with the Philistines and what have you kind of fits in here. But anyway, it was a 3-month period, and that was told David that the Lord blessed the house of Edom and all that belongs to him. So David wanted to bring the ark of the house out and to him. Now, it says that in this particular case, so David went and brought the ark out of the house of the Lord of Obed-Edom. And those that were bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces. Now, it's no longer on a cart. They are now bearing the ark. And I should have wrote that down. Let's see. 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 2, if you want to turn over there and take a look at that, you'll see what David says. So David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, No one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. So now David understands how the ark is to be moved. Those that were bearing the ark were the Levites. So David didn't understand how to move it the first time. Evidently they consulted the law, and now they understand how it is to be moved. And like I said before, why the Levites that were with them beforehand didn't tell David what to do is beyond me, other than the fact that over the years, maybe through the period of the judges and then the reign of Saul, that the study of the law was not as prevalent as it should have been. And I think that could be a danger to all of us. So anyway, in verse 16 it says the ark of the Lord came to the city of David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, as she looked out through the window, saw King David leaping and whirling about the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Now we don't know what kind of tabernacle this was, if it was just a simple tent, or if it was a tent that was built under the same construction as the pattern as the original tabernacle. We just don't know. But David built a tent there, and it may have been in his mind that, if I build a small tent to house the ark of the Lord, then I have room over here to build a temple. I don't know. But anyway, he does do a good thing. He does provide a place for him to go, and why he chose a tent over a building, I don't know. But be that as it may have been that God always lived in a tent, so maybe that's what God wanted for his ark. So anyway, Michal despised him for the way he was dancing and carrying on before the Lord. Now, we do know at one time Michal loved David tremendously. She just was madly in love with him. She helped him escape from her father Saul as he sought his life. And as we said before, she was taken from David and was given to another man for a wife. And then when David assumed the kingship over the nations, one of the stipulations was that Michal would be brought to me and restored to my household. Now, whether or not the time away from David, or the event, or the fact that David tore her away from possibly a happy home to become part of his kingdom of wives and concubines, that may have aggravated her quite a bit. She may not have thought that life was going to be very good to her after she found out that she was going to be one of many instead of first of many. And because possibly that, it said that Michal's daughter despised David in her heart. How could this man be so excited over the events when here I sit not being all that excited? So she accuses him of several things. If we jump down to verse 20, he says that when David returned from blessing his house, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today." You can look at that two ways. Was she praising him for being glorious, or was she saying that in derision? I kind of think she was saying that in derision. How glorious was the king of Israel today. You come out, you uncover yourself today in the eyes of the maids of the servants as one of the base fellows. He shamelessly uncovers himself from his dancing and what have you. But is that really the case? We know that David was dressed much like the priests were. And I don't know if I got that down here or not. In 1 Chronicles 15 and 27, it says that David was clothed with a robe of fine linen and also an ephod. And so all the priests that wore the ark wore the same clothing, except they did not have the ephod. So in other words, David was dressed just like the priests were dressed, and they were dressed modestly. So why she was saying what she was saying is, I don't understand, unless she was just mad and had something to say about it, like the base fellows that, and I guess in the world that do what they do. She was trying to accuse David of the same thing, but I can see how he was dressed like the priest, that was not the case. He was not uncovering himself, and I think that she was adding insult to injury. So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler of all the people." It wasn't before the maids of the city that he was dancing. It was before the Lord God himself who chose him before the father and all his house to appoint me the ruler of all the people of the Lord of Israel. So therefore, because of what God has done for me, God has appointed me king, God has appointed me ruler, God has appointed me all of these things to succeed your father's house. Because of that, I will play music before the Lord. I will even be more undignified than this. If you think this is undignified for a king to do, he says, you can grant that I'll be even more undignified as I praise and worship and sing and dance before God, and will be humbled in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken by them, I will be held in honor. Because they understood that David was a king, and that David, with all of his heart, was worshiping God to the best of his ability, with all of his might, with all of his strength. And that was the kind of leader that the Israelites needed. They didn't want someone that was lackluster in their worship, just come because it was expected for them to worship God, but because it was from his heart. And we'll see more of that in this next chapter. So because of all this, it says that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, when you go back over to Chronicles, it says that she had, I can't remember now, 5 or 7 sons. But these were, I think, the sons that she raised that belonged to her sister. And I think that may have been because her sister had passed away and someone was needed to raise the sons. So if you see that she had no children and you reach over in the Chronicles, it says that she had 5 or 7 sons, then of course we have to understand that they were not her legitimate children, her offspring. So going back to verse 16, we see that the ark was being brought before the Lord. David danced before the Lord, and when he finally reaches Jerusalem with it, the place that he had erected his tent, he says that then David, in verse 17, I believe that is. My verse numbers are very small. 17, it says, and David had erected it. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Then he distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his own house. And then David returned to bless his own household. So when we see the love that David had for God and wanting to do the best that he could for God, when he used his own ingenuity, thinking that I'm going to use a new ox cart, I'm going to have probably a strongest ox in the field to pull it with, he had a good intent and a good heart for what he was doing, but the method was not according to God's dictates. And we can see, like I said, preachers have preached on this for years gone by. When we do something other than what God has said in the Bible, we can expect to receive his judgment. So, but anyway, the heart of David, I think, is expressed explicitly in this, even though we see the consequences of doing what God says versus not doing what God says. We can see in David that he was a man after God's own heart. He could have simply just left the ark where it was at and not worried about it like Saul did for so many years. But instead, David wanted to bring the worship of God to Jerusalem and establish it in the nation. And I think this is his first step in doing so. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, when we look at from David and Uzzah, some things I jotted down as I was going through this. It says that ignorance of God's law will not keep you from God's judgment. Now, David may not have understood the proper way to move the ark, but God's law still stood, and he was accountable for his actions. It's kind of like today in the justice system. You know, if you get a speeding ticket, years and years and years ago, I got a speeding ticket, and when I went paid the fine at the judge, the judge told me, he says, you got to remember that ignorance of the law is no excuse. I said, well, I didn't see the sign. I didn't know it was there, you know. He said, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And that's the same thing that applies here. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. We have to understand that the law of Christ is in place, and we need to be aware of it. If we don't understand and know God's word, we are condemned to be judged by it regardless. And that's what the world outside of the family of God is faced with. That law applies to them also, and if they are not aware of it, they still are going to be judged by it. Trying to prove what God has said will bring his judgment. Okay? You know, we're told to sing today. There's a lot of religious denominations that claim to be worshiping God that have anything from rock and roll bands to full-blown orchestras. And what they're trying to do is improve on what God has told him to do. Singing is great, but all of this other stuff is even better. So they tried to improve. But even as David tried to improve on moving this in a new cart, it still brought his judgment upon him. So we should always learn God's law and abide in it always. And then some lessons that we learn from Michael is that we should show respect for our leaders as they are appointed by God. Romans 13 tells us this. And even though we have leaders that do some corrupt things, even some crazy things, we have to understand they're appointed by God, and we don't know why they're in a position of authority that they are for the things that they do. And as I said, when I look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, how in the world could he put a man in a position that would kill so many innocent people? But God has a reason for doing what he's doing. We may not understand it, we just have to accept it. Do not ridicule or show disrespect for another, especially those of the household of God. And this is what Michal was doing with David. She was ridiculing him, she was showing disrespect for him, even dislike for David. And this is not an attitude that we should have, because she was punished with it in the life that she lived. She did not have any children. And we have to understand that we have to have this kind of respect, especially in the household of God. Be truthful in what you say and what you do, because the consequences may not be to your liking. And that's exactly what happened to her. She was not careful in what she said or she did. She did not use wisdom. She did not use good judgment. And because of that, she had to suffer the consequences that she did not enjoy suffering. You know, back then, for a woman to be childless was a disgrace to her. And this was a disgrace to Michal. So some lessons that we can learn from this, and I think that was the end of what I had. So anyway, we've got a few minutes left. What do y'all think? What do y'all have any suggestions or comments? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, one of the things they said was, they taught, and I think it's just a difference between the maybe generations, but as they brought the ark up, they learned that the priests were supposed to bring it up on poles. And it's like you said, it's like they had forgotten or not learned what they're supposed to do, and then they moved it on the ark, on a cart. And then later on, as you read in Chronicles, even, it talks about David telling the priest to move the ark with the pole like it's supposed to. So it's like they had a moment of just not remembering what the law was or what God had told them to do.
You know, it had been about 400 years, I think, the period of the Judges, in which we see Israel falling away from God and doing the things of the nations round about them, the idolatry and the corrupt life that they lived, and God would send them off into judgment. He would put them under persecution of the country round about them. They would come to their senses, they would come back out, and then the next generation would go right back into it. And this went on and on for, about 12, 13 times. And I'm kind of inclined to think that during this period, they would forget God, they would just jump off into idolatry and think that, the world's doing it, why can't we do it? And, it's a great thing, let's just go ahead and do it. We have freedom to do what we want to. Even it says that during this time, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so that statement tells me that they put more emphasis upon their own self-importance and their own self-accomplishments. And even like today, when people look at, the trend of, there's a lot of trends going on, from this diversity stuff, with homosexuality and transgenderism, and then we have to be accepting of unscriptural things in the worship of God. They look at this and says, we have become enlightened. We're a modern society. Well, all these things happened before, thousands of years before. So it's not really modern, it's just, I want to do these things. And because of that, they put less emphasis upon God's word. And I think the Israelites did the same thing. Even though they were commanded daily to teach their children and never let these things depart from your household, and evidently they did. And I think it's evident from the many times that they fell off and God punished them. They came to their senses and came back, only to do it again and over and over and over again, which shows me that they had a little respect for the law of Moses, or a little understanding of it. So I think at the time of David, when David was trying to move his cart, they didn't understand how to do it. And then when Uzzah was struck dead, David was saying, we got to find out how to move this thing. And that's probably when the priest went and got the law and started reading it and understood how things were to be done. So that's my take on it. Anything else? Okay, well, that's all I had for this class. Oh, there was one thing. I have trouble pronouncing words. And I was looking up how to say one word out of this chapter. And I found a list, about 32 pages long, of Bible pronunciations. And it's got, 1,000 words in there on how to pronounce these words. So I downloaded it as a PDF, and I'll put a link to it on our newsletter for next Saturday in case you're interested in downloading it and having it, because a lot of these modern translations that we have, they don't show you the pronunciation like the old Bibles used to. And that might come in handy as we go through 2 Samuel to learn how to say some of these words. But that doesn't guarantee that I'm going to say them correctly, because I'm going to say them incorrectly regardless, because that's what I do. Just like I get Joab and Abner mixed up. I think that's going to plague me through this whole book. So anyway, that's that. Chapter 7 is an important chapter because David wants to do a great thing for God, and God tells him he's not going to do it for him. And then God tells the great thing that he is going to do for David. And that's going to be an interesting study, because what God tells David actually has a dual meaning to it, and we'll look at that. Thank you for your time and attention.